Hi there, future rockstar teachers. Today's little mini lesson here for you is about inferences and teaching inferences. Tovani, Chapter 8, is a great resource, and I think she does a really nice job of explaining inferences, talking about some of the problems students have with making inferences, especially struggling readers, but honestly, a lot of students. And so this is meant to sort of supplement that and talk about some of the questions that in this class we tend to have about inferencing. So we'll talk about what an inference is, how we know when we are asking students to do one, why they need the skill of inferencing as readers, a little bit about predictions versus inferences, and then some ideas for teaching inference. So first, what is an inference? Well, an inference is used in reading because writers don't always tell us things explicitly. It would be very boring, in fact, if they explained everything directly to us. So an inference is a conclusion reached based on evidence plus reasoning. So evidence in this case would be evidence from the text, something that you read, and then reasoning, your own brain processes. And that reasoning is always based on our experience with the world and our knowledge about the way that the world tends to work. So we use inferencing in reading to figure out why a character might have done something, character motivation. Relationships between characters, often we infer things about that. We have to infer the author's message or the theme. We infer causes and effects. We infer problems and solutions as we read, and tons of other things. There is a lot of cognitive research on inferencing, and there are multiple different types of inferences and processes that go on during inferencing. And that's all really deep sort of literacy work that you're going to find at, master's or PhD level. But for our purposes in this class and for the purposes of just teaching students to inference, I really like this equation. So we can think of inferencing as an equation. You take what I read, so anything that occurs in the text, whether it is nonfiction, fiction, visual, or any other type of text. And then you add that to what you already know. So you first have to focus on, our yellow box here is making an observation or noticing something about the text. And then you think based on what you know, and that gives you an inference. So that adding what I know is background knowledge, previous experiences, just the way that we know the world tends to work. And then we make an inference, which is a sensible conclusion that we come to about the story, the text. So an inference is a conclusion. Now, what is the difference between an inference and a prediction? Well, this can get kind of tricky, and sometimes we use the words interchangeably, but they are different cognitive processes. And I do think it's important that we're clear to students in defining these, because that clarity, again, in reading instruction, explicitness matters. So that clarity will really help students. If we're not clear on the difference and if we don't explain the difference clearly, then students may not achieve the skills that we want them to achieve because they think they're doing one, but they're actually doing the other, and then they never learn the one, right? So both inferences and predictions down here at the bottom, they do require students to combine clues. So they do take they start with observations. That's the same part of the equation. The second part of the equation is also the same. So they also combine those clues with background knowledge in both of those, and evidence to form a theory. So clues and evidence are really the same type of concept. So they combine clues and evidence plus their background knowledge to form a theory. So inferences and predictions are both types of theories that students can form. However, I'll actually start over here on the prediction side because students generally will find predicting to be a little easier. They might not find sort of sensible predictions to always be easy because it does require that attention to the text, but they know what to do for the most part when you ask them to predict. So a prediction is a statement about the way things will happen in the future. Again, based on those clues that they have from the text plus experience. And so a prediction is always about what you think will happen. So you could say, I would like to predict what tomorrow's day will be like, based on the amount of preparation I've done for tomorrow. And then a prediction can always be confirmed or denied. So it's explicitly verifiable because the answer then happens, right? Whether that prediction is confirmed or denied, you will be able to find out the next day, the next chapter, the next page, the next part of the text, whatever, right? So a prediction is explicitly verifiable, and it's always about what will happen next. What do you think is going to happen? An inference, on the other hand, is again a conclusion drawn about something you observe plus your knowledge, but it's not about something you think will happen. An inference is drawn about why things are the way they are. Why are they happening in that way? That's an inference. So not what will happen, but why is this happening in this way? So cause and effect relationships require inferences. Character motivation requires inferences, and theme or message requires those inferences. So here's the difference. I think the flowers are growing because they were planted and tended with care. So if you see flowers growing, why do you think those are growing? That why relationship requires the inferencing. So you have the evidence that, well, I saw how they were planted. I know that flowers need nutrients to grow, so that is why they are growing that way. However, you can't always check an inference to see if it's right or wrong. So this is why students often struggle with inferencing, because there is no right answer. There are wrong answers. Wrong answers are things that are not based on any evidence whatsoever. And that's a lot of what Tovani's chapter talks about. But there's not necessarily a way to check and make sure your inference is correct. You just sort of maybe check with your teacher, like, do you think this inference makes sense? And then you can have a conversation about, well, is there good textual evidence? So inferencing well is really about teaching students what constitutes textual evidence. How do we find it? How do we know when we see it? And how do we come to conclusions based on that textual evidence? So again, a prediction would be something like, I planted the flowers, I gave them the food they need, I predict that they will grow. But an inference is based on, I observe the flowers are growing, and I think that's because. So it's more of that like why type of question. So you could think of predictions as what will happen, inferences as why is this happening in this way. So again, writers don't always tell us everything directly. They often show and not tell. So in their language, in their writing, they may describe something but not tell you exactly what to make of what they're describing. And we do that because it's good writing. So here's an example. Bill stomps into the Verizon store wearing a wet bathing suit. He carries his iPhone in his hand. The screen is cloudy with condensation. A drop of water falls from the iPhone to the floor. So to make sense of this, we have to use a lot of inferencing. Bill stomps into the Verizon store. So you can ask students, well, how do you think the character is feeling if he's stomping in? Right? And to do that, we notice the word stomp. So that's our textual evidence. And then we think, what do we know about the way the world and people tend to work? If we're stomping, when do we usually stomp? And that actually is students' prior knowledge or knowledge about the way the world works. So they would be able to do, probably in high school, most of your students who are, cognitively at level, in quotes, will be able to talk about how they know stomping, right? They'll be able to infer that. And then he carries his iPhone in his hand. The screen is cloudy with condensation. A drop of water falls from the iPhone to the floor. So we can infer that the phone then is wet. We can take a look at the textual evidence of he's in a bathing suit. And then we can think about our knowledge of how the world works. Your students may have experiences where they or somebody has dropped a phone in water. And then they know that tends to break the phone, right? So their personal experience, what they know about phones, what they've seen happening in the world, all of that. So we can say, why do you think the character is doing, what is going on here? Why is this happening? You could also ask them to make a prediction. What do you predict will happen when Bill goes into the Verizon store? They may say, I predict they won't be able to fix his phone. I predict they'll tell him. So the prediction is about what do you think will happen next? The inference is about why is this happening? What is going on here? And again, we say Bill stomps because just saying Bill is angry, we don't always consider that necessarily like good descriptive writing, because we want the show don't tell paints a better picture for your readers. So some ideas about how to practice these inferencing skills are, first of all, provide a passage that doesn't say directly how a character is feeling and ask students to infer, or that doesn't say directly what exactly is going on, but has plenty of clues for students to infer. So you can do this with reading passages. I would start with really short ones and easy ones like this one. You can also work with an image. So show an image that contains clues but doesn't necessarily have an answer within the text, and then ask students to make observations about that image. So you can start with just asking students to list or tell the class, what do you notice? Without making any guesses, without making any inferences, just stop at there. What do you observe? What do you notice about this? And then those will become the clues with which you can make inferences. You can also do this with films. There's a lot of Pixar shorts that don't have any words, which means it's entirely inference that you have to use to figure out what is happening in the film and what the message of the film is. So that's a really good way to practice those inferencing skills as well. I'll show you a couple examples. Here's an image. I could project an image like this and ask students just to notice. What do you notice about the image? So they might notice the plants. They could notice the architecture. They could notice the color and style. They could notice the background, the sort of deserty, mountainy background. They could notice the sky and the clouds. They could notice the windows. They could notice sort of the cracking or the wornness. They could notice the rocks. They could notice the dirt path, right? So what do you notice? Those are the clues that we're going to use to make inferences. So I might ask students, where can you infer that this picture was taken? When can you infer that this was built? Who can you infer built these? What can you infer about the ecosystem this takes place in, right? So those are all clues. And, it's a picture. I just Googled village in Mexico. So it's a picture from Mexico. I could find out more about the architecture. So, we could verify some of these things, but the picture itself does not have a verifiable explicit answer. It's all based on inference. Pick any picture and see what students can notice and then infer based on those clues. Here's a Pixar short that's really good to use for inferencing. I'll just play a little bit of this, but you can watch the whole thing if you're interested in using it as a inferencing tool or something like this. So we have the title, but that's the only words or text that this provides for the most part. So there's a lot of inferencing that you're doing already that you might not even realize that you're doing. How are these birds feeling? I was about to ask, why are these birds mad? But even knowing that they're mad requires an inference. So how are these birds feeling? Why are they feeling that way? What can we infer about this wire? So hopefully students might say, I notice that they are tweeting at each other. I notice their eyeballs are lowered. And then they have to infer, well, what do we know about facial expressions? That's an inference. And then what can we infer about how they're feeling? Well, they're mad at each other. They're feeling territorial. They don't want to share their space. Those are all inferences, even though they seem like simple things to conclude as you're watching this. Making those inferences explicit will help students understand that they use these skills all the time. It's just a matter of making those explicit so we can apply them as we're reading as well. You could ask students to make inferences about this part. How are they feeling? Why might they be feeling that way? How is this guy feeling? What are they feeling here? Why is this happening? Why are they moving down? How are they feeling? Here you could ask them to make a prediction. What do you think is going to happen? But did you notice all the inferences that these students have to do to make sense of this and that we have to do to make sense of this? We do them naturally. It's a part of what we naturally do, but making that explicit for students will help them learn to apply it to reading and not just to these visual things. So once you practice the basics, you can get a little more complex. And we can even get into sort of visual literacy. Here's an image. You could ask students first, what do they notice? From what they notice, what do you think is worth focusing on? What do you think are the most compelling or most clue-like details that you notice? So they could notice people have baskets. They could notice what they're wearing. They could notice the race of the people. They could notice the background. And then they can infer what is happening. Why are they lined up? They can infer what is the billboard doing there. They can infer the time period. They can infer the socioeconomic status. They could then analyze and think about, the American dream. So they could think about themes or messages that this might hold implicitly. And then, of course, the goal is that they can also apply these skills to their reading to access things like characterization, character motivation, theme, and message. And they can't do any of that unless they have the skill of inferencing. So again, I have said in class, and I just want to reiterate that even your most advanced students will need a refresher at least on inferencing. So they'll need to be reminded of what an inference is. You may need to talk about inference versus prediction because they may use those words interchangeably, just as sometimes we slip and do. And a little refresher lesson or explicit repeated practice on inferencing, depending on your students' skill levels. If the text requires them to do a lot of inferencing, for example, the yellow wallpaper, we have to do a lot of inferencing to figure out what exactly is going on here based on the clues that we have. You may want to do sort of a pre-assessment. What do you already know about inferencing? What types of inferencing skills do these students have already? Because inferencing is going to be so essential to making sense of some of these more complex texts. So I hope that was helpful for you. And this pairs really well with Tovani chapter 8. So if you haven't read that yet, be sure to give that a read and think about how we can better teach our students to use these inferencing skills. Bye.